Good evening. I'm Ashley Buss. I'm a civil engineering graduate student working in the field of asphalt pavements. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Committee on Lectures with funding from the government of the student body and the Live Green Sustainability Series that works to provide opportunities to examine a wide range of issues concerning the environment. Tonight, we have the opportunity to hear from John Felmy, who is Chief Economist of the American Petroleum Institute. He is responsible for overseeing economic, statistical, and policy analysis of the Institute. He has over 25 years of experience in energy, economic, and environmental analysis. He received bachelor's and master's in economics from Pennsylvania State University and a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland. John is a member of several professional associations, including the American Economic Association and the International Association for Energy Economics. Please join me in welcoming John Felmy.
Well, thank you very much. I truly appreciate you all coming. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see a good-sized crowd. Not all economists can attract a crowd, so I'm happy to come here. I'm always happy to visit a land-grant university. As somebody who went to a couple land-grant universities, I believe strongly in the institution, and so this is my first time here, and you have a lovely little, lovely big campus here, and I had the opportunity of a pleasant drive up, and so the weather was good, so I want to thank you again for having me. Is this mic too low? Oh. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming because this country faces a real crossroads in energy. We have the ability to make wise choices, to move forward based on facts, or we can continue to move as we've done in the past, basically repeating mistakes based on more wishful thinking than real reality in the energy situation. We can have the opportunity to be able to do what needs to be done for the future of the country, or too often we can get involved in Washington, D.C. rhetoric and politics and not really accomplish much. Because basically, this country needs your help. It needs your help in terms of talking about the facts. It needs your help in terms of getting out there and talking about rational policy that we need to develop. And more importantly, the energy industry, broadly defined, needs you. Because if you look at whatever type of energy that we're going to be needing over the next 20, 30 years, all types, we have a lot of retirements coming forward. And so there are going to be wonderful opportunities in terms of jobs of all types in all types of energy sources. And given the retirements that will happen, if you choose to go down that path, you're going to be running the show before very long, because you'll be rising up as everybody else like me retires, and it's a wonderful opportunity. And so I'd encourage you to look very seriously about what you could do in that regard. What I'm going to do tonight, for about 30 minutes, I'm going to go through a lot of facts and figures, and if you would like copies of the slides, I'll share them with Pat, and or you can send me an email. My email address is simple, felmyj@api.org. And I'd be happy to share the slides with you. But there's a lot of facts, and I think they're important in terms of going through what we need to understand about energy, what we need to do, and what we don't need to do. The first part of my discussion will first of all talk a little about oil and gas, because I work for the American Petroleum Institute, and we produce oil and gas. And so I'll talk a little bit about where the markets are for oil products. Then I'll turn to what the energy situation is and how complicated it is and what we need to do in terms of moving forward. Because unfortunately, there's a lot of myths and nonsense out there that are being floated around. There are a lot of things that are being said that are patently not true. There are a lot of recommendations that basically, as I said, are to repeat the mistakes of the past. And in particular, the one that we're very concerned about is taxation of the oil and gas industry. We tried that in the past. It resulted in reduced production, increased imports, lost jobs, and then they poured the money down the drain on things that didn't work. And that's one of the things that we can't afford to do right now as a country. But first, a little history lesson. The president has said that we're an old industry. Yes, indeed, we are. We are 152 years old, commencing August 27th of 1859. This is the world's oldest operating oil well. It just celebrated its 150th anniversary on August 16th. This well was operated once a year. They produce something like 40 barrels out of it. They sell the oil in the Drake Well Museum, which if you've never had the opportunity to go there, I encourage you to. And they sell an ounce of oil from this well for $2. Now, does anybody know how many ounces there are in a barrel of petroleum? Well, there's a lot. Now there's 42 gallons, the most important number on Earth, times, of course, 128, so it gets 5,376 ounces. So they sell that oil for close to $11,000 a barrel. Pretty good money. But I bring this up because this is an example of what everybody thinks about in terms of the oil industry. They think this is the technology that we're on right now, when in fact the oil industry and gas industry is one of the most technologically advanced industries in the world. Technological advance in oil and gas has been greater than just about any other industry. We use more computer processing power than anybody but the Pentagon. And so this is not the oil industry, but yes, we're still around. We've been around for 150 years, and we're probably going to be around for another 150 years, despite wishful thinking by some people. But we had this because a bunch of economists and energy geeks in Washington hired a bus, and we went up for the 150th anniversary to celebrate the sesquicentennial, and so we visited several places, including the Drake Well Museum. We also visited a quaintly named town. Well, it's not a town anymore because nobody lived there, but it's called Pithole. It was basically another site of a gushing oil wells back in 1865. A town of 15,000 people sprung up. They operated for 500 days. The oil ran out and they moved along, and you couldn't tell there was any oil production there. But they do still have some remnants there, and so they sell that 1 ounce bottle of oil for $5. Well, that works out to about $27,000 a barrel. So, the oil industry, that's quite a good price. So what are we now as an industry? Well, it's important to understand that we're an industry that supports directly and indirectly 9.2 million jobs, 7.7% of the gross domestic product, an enormous amount of employment, an enormous amount of value added, labor income, and so on. Taxes that we pay the industry are huge. But yet in Washington, we're treated as though, you're just an old industry that's going away. Patently untrue and unfortunately not helpful in terms of today's policies. The other thing we are is an industry that's owned by tens of millions of Americans. Fully 41% of the equity, the stocks of the oil companies are owned by either retirement, in the sense of individual retirement accounts, pension plans. Millions of other Americans own investments that are in those oil companies. The oil industry is largely owned by the middle class of this country. They support pensions, they support retirement plans across the country. But yet in Washington, all the discussion is to take money from the oil industry as though no one would get hurt. It's as though some folks there seem to think that the oil companies are owned by space aliens. Now, I was just in Roswell, New Mexico, and I didn't use that line, but nevertheless, it's just simply untrue what people think about the industry is, and in particular in Washington, it's always, looking to the oil industry as a cookie jar. So where are we in terms of oil markets? Well, this is a slide that I try to show because it's one I answer more than any other, and it's, why is the price of gasoline going up? Well, the first thing you need to know, as I mentioned, was 42 gallons in a barrel. So the bottom line is the price of crude oil for the West Texas Intermediate from Cushing in dollars per gallon. The middle line is gasoline prices, and the top line is diesel prices. Now, the first question that I get all the time is, why is diesel more expensive than gasoline? Isn't it cheaper to refine? Well, no, it's not. It used to be, but it's not anymore. It's not your father's diesel fuel. What we've done is create an ultra-low sulfur diesel that we spent billions of dollars to create with less than 15 parts per million sulfur. It's clean burning. It's very efficient. I'd love to see more diesel cars, but it was expensive to produce. And also, the demand for diesel, both in the U.S. and worldwide, is much stronger than gasoline, and I'll show you that in a minute. And that's because if you look on a world level, people know that diesel is a good fuel of choice. It's clean burning now. You get 30% more fuel economy or more horsepower for the same amount of fuel, and so it's a good choice. But in this country, diesel cars are not really very popular because everybody remembers the diesels from the 1970s, which didn't work very well, to put it mildly, in terms of their performance, and they left people with a bad taste in their mouth. The middle line is gasoline. Well, one of the biggest components between that retail price from AAA and the crude price per gallon, and also historically, if you look back over many decades, the real difference, adjusted for inflation, between crude prices and diesel prices is about $1.20, but it varies depending on the supply-demand for diesel and gasoline. But the biggest chunk of that, of course, is taxes, and I'll break it out a little further and so on. And so why did we have $4 gasoline in 2008? We had a $3.50 crude oil. And in fact, most refiners for gasoline were losing money. They were breaking or making some money on diesel, but they were losing money. And right now, in the U.S., if you happen to be a refiner that is refining off of Brent crude, which is North Sea marker, for example, on either the East Coast or the West Coast, you're probably losing money right now. And nobody understands that. If you're in the Midwest, the margins are about average right now, but if you happen to be on the East Coast or West Coast, it's not a good time in terms of refiners. And I bring that up because too many people think that the oil industry is a monolith and it's all just the oil industry, when in fact it's many different components, from production, refining, marketing, pipelines, transportation, and so on. So what's the recent happening over the past? Well, why did we go up to $4 gasoline? Well, first of all, if you look, a $1.30 increase from back in September up to May, you had $1.30. You had $1.01 in crude oil prices. You had a $1 increase in ethanol, and since most gasoline is blended at 10%, that's another 10%, 10 cents in cost. And you have other costs go up, some sales taxes, credit card fees, things like that. Really can explain the increases due to costs. And similarly, on the way down, we've seen the price of gasoline follow crude. The Federal Trade Commission just documented the increase in a report that they had that talked about the cents increases and so on. But recently, just over the last month or so, we have had a sharp increase in crude prices, roughly from $75 a barrel up to almost $100 today, or over 50 cents a gallon. But retail gasoline prices have actually been following a little bit. Now, what will happen with retail gasoline prices? That's going to be very much a function of the supply and demand for gasoline. First of all, we've had a record production of gasoline this year so far, record production of diesel, and demand is weak, and so it's a soft market for gasoline, so you can't always recover your costs. Like any industry, you can't always recover your costs. Think about refiners as a baker. You don't control the price of wheat, and you don't control the price of bread. You get what's left from that. And that's the way refiners operated, and it hasn't been a great business. Diesel prices have been a little firmer and a little more of an increase because we've had increases in diesel demand. We've seen that there's two aspects of the economy, and I'll touch on that in a moment, but diesel demand has been much stronger for a variety of reasons. So why did crude oil prices go up? Well, this is one of the biggest debates that we have, of course, that whether or not it's market fundamentals or is it something artificial like speculation. Because in Washington, all too often what Washington seeks to find is a villain. Because if you find a villain, you can fix the problem because you take care of the villain. Well, that's why we don't make a lot of progress, because there aren't too many villains that you can identify. It's usually something else and a more fundamental problem. But on a day-to-day basis, there's a whole host of things that affect the price of crude oil. Of course, it's going to be things like world production, OPEC supply. It's going to be weather. It's going to be economic growth is a very important component. Exchange rates on a short term can have an impact on it. But exchange rates are generally misunderstood. People think, oh, well, the dollar depreciates, so the price of crude goes up. Well, not directly, because oil is priced in dollars. So it doesn't matter what the exchange rate is. But indirectly, you can have an impact, because what you have is it makes oil cheaper if you happen to be buying in, say, euros. But that's not well understood. Now, there's also the impact on, for example, OPEC suppliers. If the dollar depreciates, it means that their exports aren't worth as much, and so they've got more of an interest in terms of trying to have a higher price and so on. But I generally believe that it's market fundamentals. And it goes back to, I don't know, what do you have here, Econ 101 or something? At Penn State, it was Econ 2. Well, think about basic economics, your supply and demand curves. If you're going to argue that the price is artificially high for any reason, whether it be speculation, manipulation, whatever, then you're arguing that the price is above the intersection of your supply and demand curve, and you've got supply greater than demand. And so if that is happening, what you should see is inventories build up at a world level. Stocks of crude oil should be building up. They didn't in 2008. They didn't appreciably this year. And so I look at it as being market fundamentals more than anything else. But on a day-to-day basis, it's what the buyers and sellers of crude oil think it is. Ultimately, though, of course, the futures contract that you hear about, That closes, and you either have to make delivery of the contract, take delivery, or roll your contract. And at that point, the futures price equals the spot price, or as we like to say, the wet barrel price. That's not true in all commodities, but it is in oil. And so if it's the wrong price, then you have to say what is happening with inventories, and I yet have not been able to determine that that's a fact. But at a world level, of course, we don't have great data, so you can't say with absolute certainty whatever. But we can say that demand is at record levels. It fell off with the recessions, but then it rose to a record in 2010, another record in 2011 according to the IEA, and a further record. Why? I like to say 3 big reasons. China, China, China. Of course, it's more than that. It's India behind them. It's all developing countries that want transportation, want mobility, and the only way you fuel that is with oil right now in a predominant way. But until you see this change, in some way, it's a tighter market with limited increases in supply. It's not surprising why you have higher prices and so on. One of the things I can't do is forecast prices because of antitrust law. So don't ask me to forecast prices. But nevertheless, you have to look at what's going on at a world level. And most of the forecasts are for sharply higher growth in oil demand. China's buying 18 million cars a year, more than we are. Double-digit growth rate. The Indian development, the Indian economy is moving into industrial phase, and so you're seeing more oil demand there. Oil demand is weak in the U.S., but it's not in other parts of the world, and maybe weak in Europe and so on. But if you want to look to what's going on in terms of world markets, that's the first thing you look at. What is it not? It's not excess profits in a part of the oil industry. If you break down that dollar of gasoline that you buy, the biggest share is 63%, according to, this was from DOE, is crude oil. You've got taxes are 11%, and then all refining, marketing, distribution costs come in at 26%. And if you break down the earnings of the industry, you get we make somewhere around 7 or 8 cents in a dollar from all our operations. And that's far less than many other industries, more than some, of course. But if you took 100% of our profits, which is what everybody talks about, you wouldn't reduce the price of gasoline by a whole lot because that's a very low profit rate. And that's after making billions and billions of dollars of investment. The oil industry has invested $2 trillion in all aspects of the industry since the year 2000. $2 trillion. They've invested over $100 billion of environmental expenditures. They've invested more than any other area in terms of new energy technologies, carbon-reducing technologies, things like that. So we make a lot of investments, and that you should look at that as favorably because it means potential opportunity and jobs in the future. So where are we in terms of demand? If you look at total petroleum demand, it's down slightly for the year to date. If you look at gasoline, it's down a couple percent. Distillate, which includes both diesel fuel and heating oil, it's up a couple percent, and jet fuel is up. Now, what does that tell you about our economy? Well, it's important because gasoline demand tends to be tied toward things like retail sales and employment, because you drive to work, you buy stuff, and so on. And so it reflects a weak side of the economy, which is what we see from the data. We did see retail sales improve today, but I'm trying to understand how much of that was the surge in iPhone sales, which could be a significant component of that. So I'm trying to understand how much of that was an economic improvement. I hope it is. Diesel demand, however, has been strong, and that's reflective of the industrial economy moving forward. We've had significant improvements in exports. The manufacturing production seems to be doing pretty well in terms of it, and so that has to be shipped with, of course, diesel. Now, of course, you had a big corn harvest this year, and so that contributes to more diesel demand. You also have a lot of economic activity tied to, for example, North Dakota oil production, where you're shipping a lot of products like water to do the hydraulic fracturing and so on in Pennsylvania. And so that's another added component of diesel demand. So to the extent that you have one part of the economy doing relatively well and the other part not, that's a cause of concern because you can't continue to make stuff if people don't buy it. But right now, consumers are very cautious. You're fully aware of the housing situation and how it's not recovering very fast. And so I tend to look at how the economy is doing through the lens of fuel demand. And we of course, produce a weekly survey of demand and a monthly survey, which we'll be publishing on Friday. it shows, that's been pretty much the story throughout the year, and we continue to measure it carefully. Jet fuel demand has been up. We see quite a bit of business travel. We see people traveling. I travel a lot, and I haven't seen many empty seats. So what we're seeing is, at least a mixed story in terms of the overall economy. So what else are we seeing? Well, it's an interesting thing that's happened recently. This is the price. The top price is the price of oil per billion BTU, and the bottom is natural gas. We have seen natural gas prices at relatively low levels, less than a half or a third of what oil prices have been. And that's been very important because for the coming winter, those of you who have your families who heat with natural gas are going to be doing relatively well than if you use electricity or propane or kerosene and so on, according to the Department of Energy. Why do we have natural gas prices cheap compared to oil? Supply and demand. These are the shale plays across the U.S. You have, of course, oil shale plays in the Bakken Formation in North Dakota. You've also got in Eagle Ford. But you got big natural gas plays in places like Louisiana and Arkansas and Texas. And my home state of Pennsylvania, I grew up in the north central part of the state. And I'm a former dirt poor country boy who was fortunate to go to a land-grant university to get an education. And it's just wonderful to see the Marcellus shale gas being developed up there. Because as I was growing up, I remember seismic crews going up and down all those highways and I always wondered, what'd they find? Did they find anything? Well, yes, they did. They just didn't know how to develop it. Now, what you see across the northern tier of Pennsylvania, which hasn't had any economic opportunity in 100 years, you see people able to get jobs. You can come out of high school and get either a job, for example, working on rigs or driving truck or something like that that'll support a family. That's something that I never saw growing up. And in fact, I just had an opportunity to drive through there and I saw something I never saw growing up. Help wanted signs. It's an economic development that's real. Now, the opponents of fossil fuels, and there are many, are trying to poo-poo how much economic activity is there. They're saying, it's overestimated. I'm sorry. You drive through that area, and you'll see what the economic activity is, and you'll see how important it is that it's generating tens of thousands of jobs directly and indirectly. And this is just in terms of unconventional gas, and I'll turn to in a minute the other types of resources that we can develop. Because this country has a vast amount of oil and gas resources that we can develop. We can develop in an environmentally sound way. And we need to look carefully about doing that because that's one of the things that everybody is telling us, that we need to develop jobs in this country. With 9% unemployment, this is one way that we think we could do it moving forward. How did we get there? Well, hydraulic fracturing technology. The opponents of developing oil and gas have labeled hydraulic fracturing technology as all aspects of oil and gas development. That's not what it is. Hydraulic fracturing technology is merely the bottom part down thousands of feet where you fracture the shale with water and sand and some chemicals, and then you extract the gas. It is not most of the drilling technology. You have to do that technology right. You've got to have proper casing, proper cementing. It's been done for a very long time, but yet opponents of that have discovered that, we do have a lot of oil and gas, we're not running out, and so they've chosen to attack this to try to shut down development in that way. It simply is a misrepresentation of facts, and it's irresponsible in terms of what the average American consumer needs. And so hydraulic fracturing technology is an important development. Between hydraulic fracturing technology and deep water drilling, these are some of the most advanced technological developments that we've seen so far, and it's allowed us to completely change the dynamics of oil production. This representation says way up at the top where you have your aquifers and water is where you have your proper cementing that's going on, and down thousands of feet below the rock layer is what? And if you've seen the ExxonMobil commercials, for example, you see how it's described and so on. The hydraulic fracturing operations down thousands of feet have never been demonstrated to cause water problems. Other aspects, if you don't do right, can. And that's why API has been developing standards for all those types of things. We've been developing standards for the oil industry since the 1920s on how do you do proper cementing, proper casing, proper water management, and so on. And so there really is a fundamental misrepresentation on this, and it's basically being used as fear tactics to be able to try to stop development of something that we desperately need. The chemicals similarly have been described as being horror, when in fact a huge share of those chemicals that are used to be in the fracturing technology are household chemicals. Now, you've got to treat everything carefully and so on, and we have no problem with disclosing the components of those chemicals in an effort called Frac Focus. They're made available and so on. We do object to disclosing the proprietary formulas that some of the companies have spent hundreds of millions of dollars to develop, just as I'm sure you would understand why Coca-Cola doesn't want its formula disclosed, even though people drink it every single day and so on. So the point is that this can be done properly, it can be done right, and we need it going forward. Now, let me turn to a little bit about energy policy so that I can open up for questions for folks that have. This is a slide from the Department of Energy. It explains the complexity of the industry, of the energy industry broadly defined. Down the left-hand side, you'll see all the sources of energy. Down the right-hand side is all the users of energy. And in between are basically the losses. And so you roughly lose about 60% of the energy going in on that. And so it's important because, for example, in case of electric power, you lose 2/3 of the energy from the time you generate it till it gets to the households. Very complex system. The smaller components are the ones that everybody talks about: solar, wind, geothermal, and so on, and I'll turn to that in a moment. The bigger ones are, of course, the larger ones that are the conventional fuels, which are over 80% of our energy supplies and so on. If you look at, for example, what people talk about, these are the shares that you break it out. Oil, of course, is the largest. You've got natural gas, coal, nuclear, and renewables. But if you break the renewable sources down to the ones that most folks talk about, solar, wind, and geothermal, you're talking about 1% of our energy. Now, that's important, and it should grow, and I've heard aspirational comments that we want to double that, and that's positive. But it gets us to 2%, and we still need the other 98%. And so we've got to be realistic about what we need in energy going forward, or else we're going to leave people desperate for energy. I have another chart from the Department of Energy that I use that simplifies it a little more. Not much, but a little more. If there's anything you want to keep from this presentation, it's this slide. And it's from DOE, but I altered it a little bit to make it a little more understandable. Down the circles, you have quadrillion BTUs in the circles. Well, I converted that to percentages of where we get our energy. So 37.4 for petroleum, 24.8 natural gas, 20.9 coal, 8.2 renewables, and I broke out the shares where the biggest component of the renewable energy is hydro generation and wooden waste in the pulp and paper industry, and only a small share is the renewables they talk about. Nuclear powered at 8.8%, and then you can see how we use the energy down the right-hand side in terms of percent. And then the flows between are something you've got to really pay attention to. So, for example, 72% of the oil, it goes to transportation, 22% industrial, a lot of petrochemical processes, 5% goes to residential and commercial. That's mostly heating oil, which is primarily used in the Northeast. And only 1% is used for power generation. And I mention that specifically because something that's said in Washington over and over again just flabbergasts me. It's like this: we need solar wind to reduce oil use. No, that's electricity. We don't generate a lot of electricity from oil except in places like Alaska and Hawaii in backup generation. We used to, but not anymore. But people say that over and over again. As I like to say in Washington, if you say something 3 times, it becomes a fact. But, you know, the problem is the challenge of it. And so if you look at the other side, in the case of petroleum, 94% of the fuel of transportation is oil, whether it be motor gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, and so on. 3% is natural gas, and that's a share that can increase with the development of natural gas. We could see more natural gas in the fleet. You know, that's Boone Pickens's proposal. But it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and the scale is huge. And so you got to question how much you're going to be able to do, although he's strongly supportive of it, and it's a doable technology. And 3% is biofuels. Now that 3% is ethanol right now. We're going to use 12.6 billion gallons of ethanol this year, according to the law. We use about 138 billion gallons of gasoline. So we're almost maxed out with the current fleet of cars, because most cars can only use 10% without violating warranties. And the studies haven't been done to demonstrate that they can use more. And so until we have a fleet of cars that can use up to 85% ethanol, that's the challenge in terms of using more ethanol in the gasoline pool. Because you only have about 9 million flexible fuel cars in the United States, and only about 1 million of the owners know it. And so that's a challenge in terms of expanding that. With 138 billion gallons and demand not increasing significantly, we're going to hit what's called the blend wall pretty quickly, and that's going to be a real challenge in terms of what we do. Now, there isn't much electricity used for electric cars. There's only a small number of them out there. So far this year, I just looked at the numbers, and only about 10,000 electric cars have been sold this year. 10,000. That's a very, very small number, and I'll show you in a minute how electricity is used. Now, if you look at natural gas, 3% goes to transportation. It's the same mirror image. 32% goes to industrial, and that's really exciting because it's petrochemicals. And our petrochemical industry is very competitive right now because of the cost of natural gas. 35% goes to residential and commercial. That's heating, which is the largest share of heating. And 30% goes to electric power. Electric power for use of natural gas, of course, is going to expand because of the shutdown of coal plants. And that, of course, is going to be quite a bit of challenge, and it's going to be quite a bit of cost because, for example, here in Iowa, 72% of your electricity comes from coal. And so that's a big change that is going to be a challenge. But it'll be, natural gas will play a bigger role in that. Now, if we look at how some of these other sectors are going to change, you can see I won't break down all the numbers. I had copies of it and so on. But the key thing from this graph is that whatever type of energy policy you want to propose, you've got to get 100% to add up on the left-hand side. You've got to get 100% to add up in the squares. For each of the lines that are emanating from the circles or from the squares, they've got to add to 100. And so unless you can meet that condition, you're fooling yourself. Any kind of energy policy that doesn't do that is either delusional or disingenuous. But it certainly is dangerous. And so when you have people make proposals about what we can do in terms of the energy system, pull out the sheet and say, okay, show me how this is going to happen, show me when it's going to happen, show me how it's going to be funded. Because the energy system really breaks down to three big challenges. The first is scale. It's a huge industry, whether it be oil, coal, gas, nuclear, and so on. Cost. In order to change it, it costs in the trillions. And time. It takes a long time to change things like this. If you think about it, from the time that oil was discovered in Titusville in 1859, it was 90 years until oil passed coal as the #1 energy source. 90 years, almost a century. And for any type of a fundamental change that you're talking about, short of something that is just totally new technology we've never dreamed of, which I'm not going to discount isn't possible, but until you reach that point, it takes a long time. If you think about just oil industry alone, we've got hundreds of thousands of wells. We've got 150, 140 refineries. We've got about 170,000 gasoline stations. You've got hundreds of thousands of miles of pipelines. All that stuff, if you're going to come up with a substitute, it has to be replicated in some way. And so that's really the challenge. And it's got to be done in a way that the American consumer can afford. And so going forward, it's got to meet those challenges, or else, we're just kidding ourselves because too often it's just not going to happen. Now, I'll use the example, for example, of how electricity is used. And the original kind of chart was what they call primary energy. But then you need to look at, well, how is electricity used? And so I added a couple lines over to the right, and it'll show that in a second. As long as, however long Bill Gates wants me to do it. So, in any event, if you see where we have our energy use, you can see that about a quarter goes to industrial electricity, about a third goes to residential, a third to commercial, a little bit is self-use in the electric power industry, but only 0.2% is transportation, and that's mostly things like subway systems. And so the discussion right now is we're virtually focused on electric cars. As I mentioned, there only had about 10,000 sold. The president has stated a goal of having 1 million electric cars by 2015. I'm not sure we can get there. It's aspirational, and I'm not going to say we can't. But you then have to ask yourself, how much gasoline will that save? Now, 1 million cars sounds like a lot, except that we've got 250 million on the road right now that only use gasoline or diesel and so on. So if we do have 1 million electric cars, how much gasoline will that save? Well, the typical car in the United States uses about 500 gallons. So if all those electric cars use nothing but electricity will save 500 million gallons of gasoline. What's 500 million divided by 138 billion? 0.4%. And so again, we've got to be understanding of these are good aspirations, these are things we need to think about, but we have to be focused on solving the problem and the challenge going forward, or else, American consumer is not going to be happy about it. So that's where our energy system is, and so I suggest you, if there's anything you keep from these slides, it's this. What's the future look like? Well, I would say the future is going to look a lot like it does today, because I mentioned how long it takes, how much cost it is, and the scale, and so on. These are projections from the Department of Energy, and they basically show that in 2035 it's going to look a lot like today, based on technology and so on. And you're going to have growth. You're going to have market shares change a little bit in terms of where we get our energy, but they're going to be roughly about the same. And if you look at it in terms of a table, the one thing that's important is even with dramatic improvements in energy efficiency, we're still going to need more total energy, 20% more. We're going to need more of everything, whether it be oil, coal, gas, nuclear, renewables. We're going to need more of everything because everything needs to grow to be able to meet a growing population and a growing economy. And so as we look forward, we need to say, how do we achieve that? Now, these are just forecasts. And of course, there is no such thing as a fact in a forecast. It's just a forecast. And these could change. And if you think that it's different, then you'll have to show to me, how is it going to be different? What are the assumptions you're going to make? How are things going to change? How are you going to get everything to add up to 100%? How are you going to do that? Until then, I'm going to look at the Department of Energy's outlook in terms of something that's based on technology, based on policy, and so on. What can we do? Well, one of the things we can do is produce more oil and gas in this country. We have vast resources. We have, on federal lands alone, over 116 billion barrels of oil. If you produced that over 30 years, and that would be a challenge, of course, but just mathematically, if you produced it over 30 years, since there's about 11,000 days over that period, you could produce 10 million barrels a day of oil. That's how much we import. And that's just conventional stuff. That's not a lot of this unconventional stuff. And so we could produce a lot more oil and gas in this country. And people want to argue, well, but it's not going to affect the world price. I don't care. The point is, if you produce it here, it's going to generate jobs, it's going to generate revenue for the federal government, and energy security. And so it's an important thing that we need to talk about. And we just conducted a survey of, for example, what folks think in Iowa about developing more oil and gas, and it's positive, that it's supported by the vast majority of folks in Iowa. And so we need to look at this as a possibility, because the oil and gas industry isn't looking for subsidies. We're just looking for the ability to be able to produce on places that are off limits to us. But what's off limits to us right now? Well, with the latest policies, and this is a little dated because they just came out and took more off limits. Basically, the West Coast is off limits, the East Coast is off limits, the Eastern Gulf is off limits, parts of Alaska are off limits. And so we have a vast amount of our resources that we as a country are keeping off limits, unlike any other country in the world. And so it's fundamentally something we've got to address, because those 250 million cars that we have out there are going to run on oil for the foreseeable future. They're not going to be converted to electricity. They're not going to be converted to natural gas. They're going to run on gasoline. So what are the proposals in Washington? Well, the proposals are, there's a lot, and I'll just focus on a couple. The first is taxes. The president has proposed to tax the oil industry for the last 3 budget rounds that he's had. Now, it's not being characterized that. It's saying take away our loopholes, take away our subsidies, which, of course, is simply not true. If you look at the proposals that are in there, they're basically proposals that either affect all industries, and we're being singled out for taxation, or they happen to be things like expenses, which, in an income tax economy, you don't tax expenses. There are things like, are characterized like the Section 199 manufacturing credit that all industries get, and our industry only gets a smaller share of that. There's things like intangible drilling costs, which are costs. You either expense them or you capitalize them. And that just comes down to just basically singling out the oil industry. And a host of other things. The one thing they cite, of course, is they say, oh, well, you got percentage depletion. Well, percentage depletion hasn't been valid for the major oil companies since the 1970s. So if you want to severely affect a lot of the operations of smaller oil companies, that's what you can do. Access, of course, is something that we're very concerned about. The latest 5-year plan from the administration basically keeps us at the same level as what we were going back a couple years. We need to open up these areas if we are going to be able to develop oil and gas to meet the needs of American consumers. And regulations. Of course, we have a regulation-driven group in Washington that wants more and more regulation because they fundamentally believe that regulation generates jobs. Well, it does. The problem is it doesn't generate any wealth. And so you can regulate over and over again. Whether or not that helps in terms of environmental regulations, health and safety, and so on, I'm not going to debate, but we clearly have to be cognizant that that's something we've got to look at. We also have a host of other things that I'm not going to go into, but one of the biggest ones, of course, that's being discussed right now is the Keystone XL pipeline. The president just made the decision to push that back after the election. Keystone and Nebraska are talking about rerouting of the pipeline, but it looks as though they're still not going to complete the study that they want to do until after the election, even with that change. Now, the opponents of the Keystone pipeline, which have gotten frenetic, think that stopping a pipeline coming from Canada is going to stop the oil sands development. They really believe that. Well, I simply don't understand that. The oil sands are a major resource of Canada. The oil sands are worth, at $80 per barrel oil, about $14 trillion. $14 trillion. The GDP of Canada is about 1.4. The notion that Canada wouldn't develop a resource that's 10 times its GDP is just unbelievable. Of course they're going to develop it. And if they're going to develop it, where should it go? If you want to reduce emissions, if you want to talk about climate emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, it should come to the U.S. because it's not going to have as much emissions to ship it. It's going to have lower emissions for processing and using it. The alternative is, and the Canadians said today, they're going to look to China. And so you'll have higher emissions no matter what. So these arguments about the Keystone XL pipeline are just simply desperation because suddenly, again, the opponents have discovered that we're not running out and this is a vast resource that we can have. So that's one of the big hot buttons that we have. But if you sum up, what could we do as an economy? You know, since the days of Richard Nixon, we've been talking about energy independence. Well, if we were to develop the resources that we have in this country, we could double oil production. If we use Canadian oil sands, we can get significant amounts of oil from there. And with our biofuels, we can move very close to energy independence on a continental level. And it's something we really should consider because, of course, the main thing is we don't want to be shipping oil or shipping dollars abroad because everything that we spend here is going to be good for the economy. It's going to be good for workers. It's going to be good for things that you can spend instead of sending away. So I would recommend it as a policy that we look forward. But yet, unfortunately, what we have is proposals to have taxation of the oil industry. We face a choice. You can either develop more access, produce jobs, revenue, and energy production, or you can kill jobs, reduce government revenue, and reduce energy production. And by 2030, these are significant numbers, significant amounts, over 1 million jobs, government revenue of $800 billion, and 10 million barrels of additional oil supply and so on, versus the rest of something we tried before and it didn't work. So let's not repeat that mistake. To close with just one couple point, they talk about, oh, well, you know, you've got all these loopholes. We as an industry have higher effective tax rate than almost any other industries. You know, it's interesting. Everybody talks about, you know, how the oil industry has these, is getting away with these things and so on. Well, the numbers don't reflect it. And so let's look at reality in terms of what we have, because too often in Washington you say things over and over again, and nobody challenges it, and then it suddenly becomes a fact. And so as you all look at what the proposals are floating out, either at the state or federal level, I'd encourage you, challenge everything. And my slides are available for you. And if you want to challenge whether or not my facts are right, I welcome that, because they're straight from government sources or other types of academic analysis and so on. But that's really what we need, because we've discovered that when we've done surveys with people on what they know about energy, it's not much. But even worse, they're convinced in what they believe, and it's wrong. And so we as an industry are committed to getting out, to educating folks, you've seen it probably, our Sunday morning commercials that talk about what the reality of the industry is. Our companies are committed to do that. Because we can argue about policy forever, But the key thing is we can't argue about facts. We have to all agree on the same facts. We have to understand what the facts are, and then let's have a discussion and an honest discussion about moving forward on policies that we're going to need. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. I'll stop, and I'd be happy to answer some questions. And thanks very much for having me. And here are our websites. Here are our websites that if you want to get more detail and so on, they're available. There's a microphone in the back somewhere, and if anybody would care to ask some questions, and I'll also be available a short time after that. So thanks again for coming.
Is it on? Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your talk.
Yes.
So,
First of all, if you could identify your major.
I'm studying agronomy.
Okay.
And it was just related to my question because I'm wondering, what are the prospects for biofuels ever contributing a substantial portion of energy used in the United States?
Well, the current biofuels are ethanol, and there's a limitation to that for two reasons. First of all, the amount that can actually be used. The second aspect is how much land are you going to use? We're using roughly 40% of the corn crop right now for ethanol. The mandates are that we're going to go to 15 billion gallons of corn-based ethanol by 2015, and then they have a mandate for an additional 21 billion gallons of new biofuels. Unfortunately, those are not available right now. We only have a couple small-scale plants that produce amounts in the millions, but the mandates are in the billions. So the key thing is going to be, do we have a fundamental breakthrough in terms of developing cellulosic technology, biobutanol technology, things like that? We've been trying for a long time. In 1980, the Department of Agriculture said that they thought that cellulosic ethanol would be available in 5 years. Well, it didn't happen, and so that's the challenge. I think that it could happen. There are always scientific improvements. There's always opportunities to do that. But right now, in terms of what you're faced with the existing biofuels, which is ethanol, the limitations are in use and land use. Other question? Yes.
What do you think about nuclear power?
Well, I think nuclear power has got a role. I think it's going to be a growing role. Of course, we're going to have to understand what happened in Fukushima. We're going to have to understand what the ramifications are, and we don't know yet. It's a technology that works. It's a technology that's cost-effective. The interesting thing about nuclear is that it's characterized as being a domestic industry. Well, what share of our nuclear fuel is imported? About 80%. And so we're importing, and mostly from the former Soviet Union. And so that's an issue that we've got to understand. And also, we don't have any domestic nuclear manufacturers. I support all forms of energy, as I like to say. Of course, oil and gas, because I work for the industry. My father was a coal miner. My brother works on nuclear waste out in Hanford. And I burn 4 cords of firewood a year. So I support all energy. Other questions?
So my question is, the biggest complaint with developing oil and coal is carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And it can't be denied that burning these fuels does produce more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What is the industry's response to that?
Well, we're not debating the science of the issue. The key thing is, if you want to move forward to developing some type of carbon future, how are you going to do it and what are the impacts? The first thing is, let's go back to what they tried to do in the House with the Waxman-Markey bill. The Waxman-Markey bill was this huge bill put together where they didn't read it before they voted on it, and it was basically a lot of things that we didn't like because it violated 3 key principles. The first is, if you're going to develop carbon policy, it can't pick winners or losers, and it really did. Okay, it basically imposed the entire amount of limitations of carbon on the transportation sector, and in particular oil and gas, and gave a free ride in the short term to the coal industry. It has to reduce emissions in the lowest possible cost. It didn't do that. Again, The lowest cost reductions are in the coal industry in terms of that. And finally, it can't destroy jobs given that it's a world issue. If we just basically ship jobs and industry out of the U.S., emissions aren't going to go down. In fact, they're going to go up. And so whatever we do going forward, we have to cover those three main points. Because we've got all these cars that are on the road right now. They're not going to go anywhere. They're going to need fuel. And so the question is, if we produce that oil here, do we get the benefits of jobs, revenue, and energy security?
Hi. I was wondering a little bit about if you can explain to the crowd the tar sand, what they are, and also the environmental cost associated with the extraction of that.
Has anybody visited the oil sands? Okay, you should. I just got back from a trip on that. You got two aspects of the oil sands development. First of all, it's a mining technology that is higher in terms of energy consumption and in terms of producing it. But you also have the steam-assisted gravity development that looks like a factory and seems to be very efficient. So if you look at the total well-to-wheels of oil use, of energy use and emissions from oil sands versus other types of oils, including things we produce here in the U.S. like California and so on, it's not an appreciable difference. The production costs are higher. There are environmental issues. It's a mining technology. But if you look at the recovery that they have done of one of these big pits out there, it is completely recovered in terms of being able to see the vegetation, being able to see wildlife. So it can be mitigated in that sense. It's a huge resource. It's going to be developed. As I said, something worth $14 trillion is going to be developed, so it needs to be developed in the best possible way.
Yeah, just a comment. I don't agree with that, but I know it's a lot of money.
You don't think they're going to be, you think they're not going to develop it?
No, I think they're going to develop. It's so much
Okay.
money. I mean, and like you're saying, the world will need the energy, so they will develop. But I think that environmental cost right now, in terms of wildlife or extraction,
Well, I'd
and even
encourage
the
you-
CO2 that we are producing for every megajoule that we extract from the tar sand, it's not comparable. So,
Well, I'd encourage you to go there and take a look at it.
okay.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Andy. I'm in the Civil Engineering Department studying asphalt pavements. And my question is, how does the petroleum industry view asphalt as part of its business plan, market share? What % of asphalt accounts for petroleum production? And what are your basic views on asphalt production?
Well, it's very important. I mean, we're going to need a lot more asphalt because you know the conditions of the roads. If memory serves me, the share of asphalt in consumption is somewhere around 3 to 4% of total consumption. We use about 20 million barrels a day, so I don't know what the arithmetic of that works out, but it's roughly on that. It's asphalt for both roads. It's asphalt for shingles, for those types of applications. Traditionally, we have gotten a lot of asphalt from Venezuela. And that was a problem in the past where they shut down a lot of their exports and so on. Asphalt is a vital part of our petroleum supply, and we're going to need a lot more of it going forward.
Thanks. I also had another question about the fractal drilling. I'm really impressed with the technology and how it's being developed and how it can be used to drill for more oil that's harder to get to. But I've heard these reports from the media in Arkansas and I think maybe perhaps in Oklahoma that they claimed that it was producing micro tremors, possible earthquakes because of the drilling. And I don't think they had any data to back it up, but these media reports were out there. Has there been a response by the Petroleum Institute about those reports?
Well, we're still trying to understand, is there a relationship there? There may be some in terms of, I think if you trace it, the big reports kind of misidentified deep injection wells as being hydraulic fracturing. Now, deep injection wells have been correlated in terms of some seismic activity that you've seen, for example, in Arkansas, and they've shut down some of those wells and so on. They may be minor, but they're so minor that it's basically like a car driving by. They've observed that type of issue in terms of geothermal, too. And so we're trying to understand it. We're looking, what's the reality of this versus everybody's just, oh, yeah, it's causing it. You had this big earthquake in Virginia, and immediately people jumped out and said, oh, it's because of hydraulic fracture, even though there was no hydraulic fracturing around it. But until the media challenged the veracity of those claims, that's what gets repeated over and over again. And in today's society, where everything is on YouTube instantly and out over, that's the real challenge we face. We're studying it. We're trying to understand, is there a real relationship and what are the issues involved?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Could I ask another question? Is that all right?
Certainly. You got the podium.
So we hear the idea of peak oil all of the time in various forms about supplies running out and such. This is just a completely open-ended question, but what is your response to those ideas?
Well, as Dan Yergin has said, we've run out of oil 4 times already. But the fact of the matter is what happens is technology develops and markets develop to be able to employ that technology so you find more and more and more oil. In 1874, the chief geologist of Pennsylvania said we'd run out of oil in 4 years. And that was just using oil for kerosene. In the 20s, we were going to run out of oil. The Meadows and Meadows Club of Rome said we were going to run out of everything in the early 70s. We had the peak oil groups that have said that. What happens is technology continues to develop, so we find more and more oil that we didn't think we could find. In the deep water, for example, the technology we developed, I remember back in the early 90s, we thought there was only 1 billion barrels of oil. Now we've got orders of magnitude more that we think we can produce cost effectively. Economists basically say you never run out of anything. It's a question of what the price is, though, and that's important. But in terms of peak oil, yes, we could reach peak oil, but not because of supply. We could reach peak oil because of demand restrictions. If you impose some type of worldwide carbon program that dramatically raised costs on using oil, then you could reduce consumption and you could have effectively reached a peak. In the U.S., we're getting so efficient with the vehicles and so on that gasoline demand has been going down. Diesel has been going up and so on. But, I really don't believe that we're going to see peak oil in my lifetime, certainly, and I hope to live a long time.
I'm an agronomy major. You sort of touched upon one of my questions I wanted to ask. There's a huge investment in infrastructure for the petroleum industry, very huge. Your slides showed that it's bigger than any other sector, which leads to my question, won't the petroleum industry kick and scream and fight as hard as they can to maintain the status quo so that renewable energies and other alternative energies won't be able to get into the marketplace?
Well, if you look at what we're doing, that's not true. As I said, we are the largest investors in terms of carbon-reducing technologies, new energy forms. You've heard the commercials from our companies, whether it be Chevron, BP, ExxonMobil, about developing these new technologies, whether it be solar, wind. Geothermal, of course, we're good at because we know how to drill. You've got algae technology and so on. We've invested more than anybody else. Now, we haven't invested as much in those technologies as, say, we have in oil and gas production because our job is to keep those service stations running 24/7 or else people aren't going to be happy. And so we invest in new technologies. These companies are energy companies, and so they're looking forward to what are the new opportunities. But we also have to understand, what's the reality. We invest about 3% of our funds in those new technologies, and they're, as I said, 1% of our supplies. And so that's what the challenge the companies have, and so on.
Thank you for coming this evening, and thank you, John, for your wonderful talk. Would everyone join me in one last round of applause for John?
Thank you.